here's a copy of the first page of Talmud, which we talked about, comes from the order is Zeraim, or the agricultural laws, but this particular, what they call a Masechet, this particular tractate, is actually brachot. You remember the word bracha for blessing. That big Hebrew word that kind of has a border about a quarter of the way down the top of the page, that's me'ematai in Hebrew or Aramaic, which means from when. I mentioned to you that the very first chapter of the Talmud, Mishnah and the Talmud, talk about from which time can you actually still be saying the Shema and have it be valid, or for your morning prayer as opposed to the afternoon prayer or the evening prayer or whatever. So that's the way it is. So the first word, as it is in many books that we see, the first word or the first letter is really highlighted, made bolder. And then if you kind of pinch out with that picture, I'm trying to look and see if it's not that easy. So this is all what's in the center in block Hebrew print. If you can recognize the Hebrew letters, that's quote from the Mishnah about 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Well, okay, so yeah, that's fine. Okay, so again, in the center there that's in Hebrew print, even though it's actually Aramaic language. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down from the top of what she's showing you right there, there's a larger and bolder, the Hebrew letters Gimel Mem. That means that's for the Gemara. So that's where the commentary or the discussion of the Mishnah text would begin. That's how it's printed. Off to the right and off to the left are the different commentaries that we were talking about. The Rashi or the Tosafot, primarily Rashi's grandchildren and his disciples. But you can notice, I was joking about it last week, you can notice that the font is different, the script is different. That's what they call Rashi script, and given special honor to him. So all those commentaries are written in that kind of script. And the farther away that you are from the main text, and the farther away that you are chronologically, the smaller the font will be. As you see, as you're looking at it go farther off to the left, and the letters get even smaller and smaller. So that's just wanted to share with you. That's the page of Talmud that I was asking you or trying to describe, so that you can visualize what it looked like if you hadn't ever seen one. Thanks, Ruth Ann, for putting that up.
Oh, you're welcome.
The other thing we mentioned near the end of the day last week, that an example of contemporary midrash. Actually, this is from the Torah study class. Now that I think of it, we were talking about the binding of Isaac, and we mentioned about the Leonard Cohen song called "The Story of Isaac," and I did some research into that. So on Saturday morning, we'll look and see. But that's another example of a different type of modern midrash. But probably the most familiar modern midrash to almost all of you will be an experience. I remember going to the Colony Theater in Shaker Heights, Ohio, in the mid-50s, probably, on this huge screen to see the Ten Commandments, right? Cecil B. DeMille's The 10 Commandments. And if you get the chance to see it again, or if you can think back to it, it is 100% midrash rather than any significant percent based on the biblical text. Okay, the Bible, the Torah, in no way implies or states that there was a relationship between Moses and Nefertiti, for example. But Cecil B. DeMille does have that, and so Yul Brynner and Charlton Heston are vying for the affections of Nefertiti. That's not based on anything that's in the Torah. In the Torah, you might remember, the Pharaoh's daughter picks Moses up out of the little basket in the river, gives him the name of Moses or Moshe, which means brought out or lifted out of the water. And then the next sentence is, and the lad grew up, and one day he went out and saw an Egyptian taskmaster beating an Israelite. Well, what happened in all those years from when he was an infant, until we know how was he brought up? We know that his mother Yocheved was his nursemaid, but exactly how did that happen? How often did he see her? Did he live with her? Did he live in the palace? Did she teach him Hebrew? Did she, what? None of that. It's in Cecil B. DeMille's midrashic interpretation of the story, but it's not in the text. So if you want to know how 20th century and now into the 21st century starts to deal with biblical texts, and given the media that are available to us, and the science and the linguistic study and all that, start with the Ten Commandments by Cecil B. DeMille, and then you go from there. Okay. So I wanted to come back. I felt that I needed to give you just a few other examples or clarification of what I was talking about in the Talmud, that there's basically two types of discussion. There's a discussion that refers within the generic context of what we call halacha, of Jewish law, although it's more than law. It's law, it's ritual practice, it's observance, it's how to maintain your household. That's all halacha, as opposed to what we call agadah, which would be, I translate as legend or law or lore, legend or lore. And I found a quote, an example. So let's do the example of the Agadah first, and then I'll come back to halacha. So I'm kind of giving this as a quote from one of the simple or simplistic introductions to Talmudic literature that are in my library. So here's an example of Agadah, of Midrash, that's in the Talmud, where the sages were able to intuit where a specific word contained a hidden message that explains elements missing from a story. So remember that Bible and the Torah study people probably will remember this. I don't think I was with you specifically the day when we encountered this verse, but there's a character named Haran. It's also a place, but there's a character, Haran, who is Abraham's brother. Okay, and the Torah says, it's Genesis chapter 11, verse 28, if anybody wants to look it up. The Torah quote is, Haran died in the presence of his father, whose name was Terach, in the land of his birth, Ur Kasdim. That's Ur of the Chaldees. Okay? All right. Straightforward, right? Okay. Haran died in the presence of his father, but there's a hidden story here. And the Midrash in the Talmud, wanting to try to prove a particular point, and we'll talk about more of why they want to do that. So here's how it goes. The Hebrew term, and those who speak Hebrew will will affirm for me, I'm sure. The Hebrew term that where it says that Haran died in the presence of his father Terach is al pnei. Now, al pnei can mean in the presence of or in the face of, but it also can mean, certainly in the Torah, it can mean because of. Now, all of a sudden, we have a different question, okay? That Haran died because of his father, because of Terach, that Haran died as a result of something that the father did, either directly or indirectly. Now, you may remember the story, and it's not in the Torah, it's all in the Midrashic literature, in the interpretive literature, about why Abraham, or how Abraham challenged his father, because the father was an idol maker, right? Okay, and Abraham challenges his father and says, why do you worship these idols? And there's that whole thing. Okay, Abraham taunts his father with logic, pointing out that the man-made idols were produced perhaps in a few hours, that man shouldn't worship anything so much younger than he was. And Abraham's words ring true with Terach, apparently, and the father gives up idol worship. So that's the way that we teach the lesson. Now, here's how the Talmud continues with that story, okay? Might just be that, okay, we needed to hear that Terach gave up idol worship. All right, but continues. Then a woman came with a handful of fine flour to offer to Terach's idols. In her presence, Abraham took a stick and broke all the images except for the largest one. He placed the stick in the hand of the one idol. When the father returned and saw the havoc that had been wreaked on his gods, he demanded an explanation. Abraham sarcastically explained that an offering of fine flour was brought to the idols. They quarreled with each other as to who should be the recipient. The largest one took up a stick to chastise the offenders, and in so doing reduced them to rubble. Terach was not satisfied with the explanation, and he took it as a piece of mockery. When he thought of all the customers he had lost under Abraham's supervision, he grew more than a little angry. So he took Abraham to have a little talk with the world-renowned leader and master of all idolatry, who's a king by the name of Nimrod. Now we interact with Nimrod many times in the Torah, but Nimrod, this is not Torah. Again, this is Talmud and Gemara and Midrash and interpretation. Somebody's got a great imagination. Nimrod suggests to Abraham that since he refused to worship his father's idols because of their lack of power, he should worship fire, which is very powerful. Abraham pointed out that fire may be powerful, but water can extinguish the fire. Well, then, said Nimrod, let us declare the water to be God. But, replied Abraham, the clouds can absorb the water, and even they are dispersed by wind. So wind must be God because it's more powerful than the clouds. Bear in mind, continued Abraham, that man is stronger than wind. We can walk against it, we can resist it, we can stand against it. Nimrod became very weary of arguing with Abraham and decided to cast him before his God of fire, challenging the God of Abraham to deliver him, to save him. God indeed, the Ribono Shel Olam, the master of the universe, the Holy One, indeed saved Abraham from the fiery furnace. And now we'll finally get to the bottom line here. Witnessing this event, Abraham's brother Haran was also challenged to declare that his God was Abraham's God, but Haran wavered between the two opinions, and he delayed his answer until he saw Abraham had been totally saved. When he saw that Abraham was saved, he declared himself, this is Haran, he declared himself on the side of Abraham's God, thinking that he too, now becoming an adherent, a believer, would be saved by the same miracle. Nimrod, however, cast him into the fire as well, but since Haran's faith was not authentic and depended on a miracle, he perished. In this way, Terach's actions dealing with Abraham indirectly led to the death of his son. The entire episode is hinted to in the words, in the presence of, because of Terach, because of Terach's actions, where the Midrash has indicated an alternative interpretation of this phrase. Okay, now, I just ran through that in, I don't know, 7 minutes, but it probably takes up, the discussion of it takes up 2.5 pages in the Talmud as they dissect it and they argue it and they say, well, I thought that, and then somebody, of course, says, but wait a minute, is that the same Nimrod who did this? And then somebody said, oh, and last week I was a tourist and I went to visit Nimrod's castle up on the Golan Heights, and and all of that is then included in the Agadah type of literature in the Talmud. Yes, Steve.
Yeah, just a very interesting sort of a footnote to that. One of the Ladino songs that I had in my program this morning was Cuando el Rey Nimrod, which is that whole drash in Ladino, except without the Haran part and the offering the flower. But it is about the throwing in the fire, and it's a very curious story. So also it adds a bit about Abraham being very precocious.
Yes. And
going from birth to adulthood in a very short time, and sort of being in charge of things and telling his parents what to do, and hiding out in a cave. So just kind of interesting that and that supposedly is based, that song is based on
that particular legend, if you will. Okay, all right. But then, yes, Marty, please. You're muted, Marty. Marty, you're muted.
Okay, Rabbi, this shows you how long ago rock, paper, scissors was out there
as a cultural kind of thing, right?
Concept.
Well, this is more powerful than that, and this is more powerful than that, right? Sure, good. Okay, now the other pattern, well, I'll use that word. The other pattern of Talmudic literature could be characterized as what's called halacha or halachic, and I chose an example that again, if we had time, it could be an entire class, but it relates to the role of women. The role of women in ritual practice, or just in larger terms, the role of women towards the mitzvot, towards the commandments, the 613 commandments. Are women obligated to the same degree that men are for the mitzvot, for the commandments? Now, I'll jump ahead. The end result, after many pages of debate, and actually the debate is referred to in 2 different tractates, 2 different books of the Talmud. But the starting point actually, and the end result is that, incidentally, if you didn't know this, that women are obligated only to those mitzvot that are not time bound. And again, we could have a much longer discussion about that. Women are, we'll phrase it differently. Women are exempt from those mitzvot that must be done at a specific time. If it's a generalized mitzvah, the one I'll give you the example here, then women are not exempt. and they have just as much obligation as the men. But how do we know that? That's the question that the Talmud has to ask. And the example that they use is from my favorite Torah portion. We just encountered it a few weeks ago. I told you about it. It was the end of April, beginning of May. It's the Parshan of Kedoshim. It's the Holiness Code, chapter 19 of Leviticus. It's right in the center of the Torah, of the Sefer Torah, of the scroll, and the most familiar part ends with V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. It's all part of the Holiness Code, and one of the phrases is, it's again, if you're looking it up, it's Leviticus 19 verse 3, that every man, and man here, the Hebrew word is ish, which is literally a man. Every man shall revere your mother and your father. It doesn't take anybody by surprise. It's one of the 10 Commandments as well, although the order is reversed. In the 10 Commandments, it's honor your father and your mother, and here in order to be holy, and that's a whole other sermon also. I won't go there, but here is in order to be holy, you revere your mother and your father. Okay, but it says ish. It says every man should honor or revere mother and father. So how do we know that women were obligated to honor their parents as well? The answer is readily apparent in the Hebrew, but not in the English. It's because in the Hebrew, the verb to revere is in the plural form. Okay, so even though it says every man, the you shall do this is in the plural. Okay, so as a result, they start talking about, well, do we have to start looking at every mitzvah in the Torah? Is it written in the singular? Is it written in the plural? And they come up with, eventually, after all of the discussion, they come up with this overriding statement of that women are exempt from those mitzvot that are time-bound or time-oriented. But that's the way that it starts, and then expands from there. The other one, and some of you, I'm sure, will remember either a discussion that I led with you, or with some other opportunity to study the whole concept of the mitzvot. What's the very first mitzvah in the Torah? Not the first of the 10 Commandments, but what's the first mitzvah? The Adam and Eve is be fruitful and multiply. In Hebrew, it's puru urvu, be fruitful and multiply. And then, so that's the straightforward statement that God says to human beings, but then the rabbis jump in, dealing with the following. I don't want to call it a contradiction. I guess a repetition or a redundancy or a phrase that's superfluous. In Genesis, Genesis chapter 5. The quote is, you might remember that there are two different creation stories in the beginning of Genesis, right? So in the beginning of Bereshit. So in Genesis 5, it says, male and female, God created them. In Genesis 2 is a different story. God created Adam, and then Eve was created from Adam, but also there's the notion that at the other time, at one time there's this long process of creation. At the other time, it happens, as they say, bevat echad. At one moment, God says poof, and male and female are created. So why are there the two stories? The Talmud the halacha doesn't really answer why there are two stories, because the Torah, the Talmud and the rabbis don't necessarily see them as being contradictory. They're just different ways of explaining the divine process. And we see it differently, but in their minds, it's the same. They're much more concerned not about why the phraseology would be different in one chapter as opposed to another chapter. They're much more concerned on when they see this peru urvu, they see this be fruitful and multiply. And again, is that addressed to only Adam if Eve comes later? Is it addressed to only Eve because she's the mother of all life? Eve, Chava, her Hebrew name actually comes from the word that means life. So they try to understand, well, where exactly is the mitzvah, is the commandment, be fruitful and multiply? And again, they turn to the Hebrew text. It doesn't show, it's not as apparent in English, but in Hebrew, it's in the plural. Okay? So they resolve that. So the mitzvah is applied to both, to male and female, because it's in the plural. And at that time, Adam and Eve were the only ones alive. Therefore, it was addressed to both of them. Then you get into a more interesting discussion. And again, some of us have had this conversation before. I remember talking about it in the library when we were in the building, however many months ago that was. Okay, is how many children do you have to have, or minimally, how many children to be acknowledged as having fulfilled the mitzvah? Okay, if the mitzvah is be fruitful and multiply, how many children must I have
to be fruitful?
And is it addressed to each individual? Is it addressed to Adam and Eve individually? Or is it addressed to the quote unquote married couple? Because we don't really know that Adam and Eve were married, but the assumption is because they were, they were together, therefore they must have been married in however that term would be understood. And the debate goes back and forth. Well, between this and between this and between this and between this, how many children must you have? Until ultimately it comes down to those two fellows who we've talked about a number of times, and we always turn back to them, Hillel and Shammai, right? Okay. Ultimately, it comes down to Hillel and Shammai. Shammai goes first. Shammai says the answer is you must have two boys. You must have two male offspring. Hillel says, well, that's ridiculous. How can you multiply if there are only males involved? So Hillel's answer is one boy and one girl. And that's the way that the halakha develops. But of course, you can't stop there. And they look specifically, generations later, but they look specifically at Rashi. And they say, wait a minute, Rashi only had daughters. Does that mean that an Ilui, such an important rabbi and teacher in all of Jewish history, does that mean that there was a mitzvah that he did not fulfill? Would God have allowed that? Therefore, the Tosafot, the Tosefists, the supplemental commentators say, aha. And this is why some people say it must be the grandsons who step in and say, okay, as long as in your line. So if you have, let's say, so Rashi only had daughters, but once one of those daughters has a son, that son can revert back to Rashi's credit, okay, to the grandfather's credit. And that's the way that they resolve it. But that's the way that they deal with it. Some of it we see it and we look at it, we see page after page, and paragraph after paragraph and argument after argument. That's Nourishkeit. It's ridiculous. It just goes on and on down to the nth degree, as we say, ad nauseum. And others say, no, it's fascinating that they can find so much to look in it, to seek and to find and to turn it over and turn it over and turn it over. That's a phrase right from the Talmud, that every time you turn it over, you're going to find a new question or a new interpretation. And ultimately, as I've said a couple of times, there's either a majority opinion that here's the result, but we're going to include the minority opinion, or they say we'll wait for God's voice to come down in a bat kol, or we'll wait for Elijah to come and resolve the issue. But that's okay. So I wanted to go back. I took a couple of minutes longer than I wanted to, but I wanted to refer back and conclude the Talmud with those examples and those clarifications. Now I hope that you'll pardon me if the smile comes on my face, because I've said a couple of times that the Midrash specifically, that this type of literature really is my favorite in studying and in teaching. Both the historical as well as some of the contemporary Midrash, and I don't mean just Cecil B. DeMille or Steven Spielberg or Leonard Cohen or Woody Allen or whatever, but whatever. So the best way for me to introduce the Midrash and Midrashic literature to you, I think, is in the following way. Well, certainly some of the history and some of the necessity for Midrash, and then how it plays out, and then with a lot of examples, and we can even perhaps try to write our own Midrash in a sense. I think I mentioned to you last week that one of the professors with whom I first studied this literature, whenever I think of him, his name was Eugene Mahali. He was a Hungarian. So if you think of the character of the Count from Sesame Street, the Count, he was thought he was very polished, but he really wasn't. And his phrase to us as students was that always look to probe the text. Now, those of you who went to medical school may have had a different professor who said probing means something else, but for us as rabbinic students, it was probe the text. What can you see in the text? What can you infer from the text? I describe it more as Midrash comes along to fill in the blanks that the text just leaves there, or the text as we have it. It may not have originally been missing these details, but the text as we have it is missing the details. It's also missing many voices. Sidebar, those of us who are involved in the Torah study, for example, on Saturday morning, right now are kind of looking to hear, in the story of the binding of Isaac, we're looking to hear Isaac's voice, we're looking to hear Sarah's voice, we're looking to hear the voice of Abraham's servants who went along with him, if it's not in the text. And so the Midrash comes along to try to fill in some of those blanks, but Midrash in and of itself, and I'll talk about how we divide it up, but Midrash in and of itself doesn't try to provide answers. Like the Talmud would do. Midrash tries to provide illustration and guidance. Perhaps you might want to understand the story this way. Or from my background and my experience as I'm kind of paraphrasing an ancient rabbi, as a rabbi or as a shepherd or as a farmer or as a soldier, whatever it might be. From my experience, this is the layer of interpretation that I can add in. This is my frame of reference. And then similar, but no one writes in an authoritative statement, this is the ultimate way of understanding, or this is the only way of understanding this story, or these are the only details that would corroborate the validity of the story or the narrative the way that we have it. They're all, here's a possibility. Do you like this possibility? Does it resonate with you? If it does, then hold on to it. Use it for your life. Use it in your teaching, and whatever it might be. But there's rarely an attempt of saying that this is the way that you must understand the story. And so that's why I truly love this kind of material. And if I can inspire you, and motivate you a little bit to continue with me in our future, I will be very, very satisfied. Basically, when we talk of a classical midrash, we're talking of collections of these, witticisms or what's the word I used before? The lore, the legends that come along from approximately 400 to approximately 1200 of the Common Era. Now, some of them are much older. They appear in older literature, but they're brought together in these anthology collections in that period, between 400 and 1200. Think of them, if you will, they're primarily orally handed down before they're written. Think of it, and I'll talk a little bit more about this also. Think of it in the same sense as the more modern sermon. Okay. Now, sometimes the sermon may be based on a political situation or something these days, but the sermon was originally an interpretation and an explanation of the Torah portion, or a Haftarah portion, but certainly from the Bible. So a sermon that would refer to the lessons that should be taught and then handed down for hundreds of years, but not necessarily in quotation. It was important for the Torah to be read 2 or 3 times a week, and everyone, one of the mitzvot is that everyone should hear the Torah read in its entirety. As a matter of fact, one of the mitzvot in the book of Deuteronomy is that everyone should participate in the writing of a Torah once in his or her lifetime. That's why they have there are these programs where the sofer, the scribe, can come and be writing a new Torah scroll, but will leave many of the letters just as the outline. So you or I can come along, of course, for the right price, but you or I can come along, and with the sofer, with the scribe's feather pen and the correct ink, we can fill in the outline so that we have participated in the writing of a Torah and fulfilled that particular mitzvah. There are 2 ways of looking at the midrashic literature then. One is to help us understand, to look at this interpretation of a particular story or a particular quote or a particular mitzvah, if you will, why it happened, how it happened, a biblical text, a sacred text. It may not be based on the Torah. It may be based on something from the Psalms. It may be based even something from what's called the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha are other holy books that didn't quite make it into the canon, the official collection of the list of the books in the Bible. So one would be explaining, interpreting the text or the situation, whatever it might be. The other is, and this is what we're probably more familiar with, what kind of teaching, what kind of guidance can we derive from the text, and recognizing those who are professional educators amongst us right now, the 20th or 21st century phrase would be values clarification. Okay, so the Midrash, much of that literature, in addition to just providing explanation, is also trying to provide values clarification. What does it mean to actually have this verse, this story, this character be part of our Jewish lives? So there's legend, there's lore. Some of it is, as we were talking about, within the context of Talmud. There's halacha, there's agadah. The material that is more halacha in the Midrash leads into the process that we would be getting to in our next couple of weeks after this. That's case law, or what's called in Jewish tradition responsa. And the agadah, or the legend and the lore, kind of lead us more into what they call homiletics, which is, the homily, the teaching lesson, or the sermon, if you will. Most of the literature is going to be based on some kind of a proof text, either to give it validity, or more often it's to try to answer a question. Like I said, fill in the blanks. Here's the quote. I'm not really sure how to understand that, so we're gonna fill in the blanks. We mentioned a couple of weeks ago. We mentioned the 4 levels of interpretation. There's that word pardes in Hebrew, paradise. So there's the pshat. There's the simple way of looking at the story. There's the remez, which is the hint of what may have been happening. There's the drash or din. There's two Hebrew words that begin with the letter daled. One is the exploring or probing the text, and the other is din, which is the judgment or the law that might come out of your understanding of this particular quote or story. And then the last one is the sod, which is the secretive or the mystic understanding. So the Midrash doesn't have, chapter 1 is going to deal with the pshat, chapter 2 will deal with the remez, chapter 3 will do, it doesn't happen that way. Within the same paragraph, you could have this rabbi understands the story this way, this rabbi understands it this way, because his approach, if you will, his particular perspective was more towards the mystical, whatever it might be. Our friend Hillel that we talked about derived 7 basic principles of understanding a Hebrew text. They're known as the hermeneutic principles. Hillel had 7. The more famous Rabbi Ishmael had 13 in the 2nd century of the Common Era. And in many traditional prayer books, in the Siddur, they will list those means of study or reasoning on how the midrashic literature would develop. I would leave it to, let's see, I've already talked about the doctors, I've talked about the educators, so I would leave it to the attorneys in our midst who might want to look at the way that the logic develops philosophically in understanding how to work with a particular text. Some examples that you may have encountered. One is, if such and such, if A and if there's A, that's the syllogism, right? If A, then B, and if A is true and B is true, then C is, if C is equal to A and B, then it's true also. So that working from the minor to the major, and you can expand or generalize from that. They working on the assumption that everyone was familiar with the entire Torah text, if not the entire Tanakh, the entire Bible text. that everyone was familiar with it. So they might take a word or a phrase or an individual who appeared in a different a different book, or as the Torah study people again are familiar with hearing that there's no present, there's no past, there's no future in understanding the Torah. So even though something may have happened 500 years previously, it doesn't matter. In the Midrash, you could have those two characters speaking to each other, for example. All right, so that's some background. The Bible, the Tanakh per se, the Torah certainly does not give us, when there are these narratives and stories about characters, and we could list them. We could sit and we could say, okay, who are the most famous characters in the Torah or in the Bible? Who are these people that we want to study all the more? The patriarchs, the matriarchs, the prophets, the Moseses, the Joshuas, the Deborahs, the Miriams, whoever they are. We know what they do. We most of the time, or I'll do it positively. We rarely know what they think or how they feel. We know what they say, we know what they do, but we rarely know their motivations. We rarely hear their feelings or their thoughts. And similarly, the Torah or the biblical text assumes that we know the chronology, that we know the geography, that the Torah will just mention a place. Every once in a while, we encountered this last Saturday, it'll say this place was named Beersheba because of something that happened there. But more frequently, there's just a place that is named, okay, Tucson, Green Valley, Phoenix, Sierra Vista, and because everyone who was participating in the discussion or the assembly knew about those places, knew where they were, probably had visited them, or knew at least some of the stories of what had happened there. So we're beginning with a lot of assumptions that the reader or the student or the teacher of the time of 1800 years ago, that they were all familiar with all these. They didn't necessarily have to explain everything. But since we, not just Jews, because in other traditions as well, certainly in Christianity that leads into their sacred literature, but since we desire answers and explanations, and we want to understand, and we want to probe, and we want, we're from Missouri, maybe, show me, explain it to me, and make it understandable to me, make it important to me. So the Midrash, the rabbis, the sages, the scholars, the teachers, try to unravel some of these mysteries and fill in the blanks. This is what happened. I'll use the Cecil B. DeMille example again. This is what happened to Moses when he was growing up in the palace, but his mother, Yocheved, and his sister Miriam, even though he was known as an Egyptian, they still trained him about their Hebrew heritage and the Israelite heritage. There's nothing in the text that says that, but that's what we're going to assume, and that's what we will follow, so that it's more relevant for us, so that it continues to speak to us even in 21st century. I mentioned this in passing earlier, that for the rabbis, the contradictions or the difficulties the linguistic problems, or the fact that some detail may have been left out, that's not a problem. It's an opportunity. Let me say it again. The contradictions and the things that we might find when we're studying a text and say, well, why does it say it that way? Or why does it, and da, 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 da. For us, it's a problem. Well, who wrote it and why? What was their? Why is that included here as opposed to there? And that wasn't the issue for them as a problem. It was an opportunity to probe and to work with and to explore and to, again, make for their day, to make the text more relevant and more resonant. And that's not just with the legend and the lore, with the Agadah, it's also with the halachic. So they knew the text, the quote that I mentioned to you before, that's at the end of chapter 19 of the Holiness Code, V'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that's a high ethical statement. But what did it mean as far as daily practice? And what does that impose upon us? And which is the stronger imperative? To love your neighbor or to love yourself first, so that you can love your neighbor with the same emotion that you love yourself? And that's, it gets expanded that way. And what does it mean for our daily practice? And how is that ritualized in what they do? Okay. But again, I really like that. And I forget, out of all the teachers that I've encountered, I forget which one actually gave me that phrasing, that the linguistics, the difficulties, the contradictions aren't problems for the Midrashic rabbis, they're opportunities for them to delve further into what the text is. Okay, so my watch says just about 3 o'clock. So okay, so there are a number of different types of collections of midrash that have been brought together through the centuries. The earliest is we would probably call, and I used this term before, homiletical, the homiletics. Back in the early 1970s in rabbinic school, we didn't take a class in sermonizing. We took classes in homiletics, and that was as opposed to the speech. Okay, we had to take classes in public speaking. We had to take classes in writing, and we took classes in homiletics, the art of developing a sermon. The best example of homiletic midrash is actually, well, and when you think about it, it makes sense, is actually the collection of, or collections, there are several, of interpretive literature on the book of Leviticus. So when you think of the book of Leviticus, by definition, in Hebrew it's Vayikra, but in the Greek and the English, Leviticus, it has to do with all the rites and the rituals and the sacrifices and the things that the Levites were supposed to do and the priests were supposed to do, and all of this kind of stuff. And it's almost every other sentence, if not every other paragraph, is, well, what does that mean for me in the 21st century? There's no longer a temple in Jerusalem. We're not offering sacrifices. We don't have the Kohanim and the Leviim, and we don't have all this. So the homiletical midrash began by trying to somehow take all of these laws, this whole literature, and try to make it relevant, add layers of wordplay and associations, and today actually what we would say, not just the wordplay but the role play. What would it have felt like to be the Kohen Gadol, to be Aaron the high priest, entering the Holy of Holies as he did only once a year on Yom Kippur. And you know, how do we describe his awe? How do we describe the power of that moment? Was he filled with fear? Was he filled with a sense of authority? You know, that's the kind of midrashic literature. Let's put ourselves in his shoes rather than just studying what actually the particular practice. Okay, so that's homiletical. Another one that, another collection, if you will, or a way of categorizing the midrash is exegetical. My English is going away. You probably know the word exegesis. Okay, exegesis is reading into the text, right? Exegesis is reading into the text. So it's focusing on a particular verse rather than an entire narrative. And some of the examples that I gave before, we pick a verse, even admitting that we're picking it out of context. Or it may not be just a verse. It may be a particular episode or experience. So all of the midrashim, or all of the commentaries or the stories that related to the period of time in the Israelites' history between crossing the Reed Sea, not the Red Sea, but crossing the Reed Sea, the Yam Suf, until they arrive and have the revelation at Mount Sinai. It's not a long time in history, but it's momentous in the life of the people. And so it's almost like some of the rabbis said, okay, let's take each day, or actually each week during that period of time, the 7 weeks, during that period of time, let's look at each week. What happened? What stories can we tell? What do we assume is going on in the people's minds? What's going on in Moses's mind? What's going on in Miriam's mind? And et cetera, as they lead the people from one to another. There's one of the collections of midrash is called the Mechilta. That's in modern Hebrew. More likely in Aramaic, it was pronounced the Mechilata. But that specifically collects all of the midrashim that were known at the time about that period, from crossing the Reed Sea through the revelation at Mount Sinai. A third way of categorizing the midrashim would be narrative, and that's kind of what we'll be doing a lot of, and that's adding the voices that we don't hear. That's filling in the blanks, adding a layer of parable, and not just about the Torah or the biblical text, but also about the rabbi or the sage or the scholar or whomever who first told that story. So if it would be as if, and I was mentioning to the Torah study people on Saturday that one interpretation of the Binding of Isaac story, as it was told to me by Rabbi Philip Horowitz, who was my rabbi growing up. And now I could stop there and just go on. Or I could say, and let me tell you some other things about Rabbi Horowitz. And we go on for the next 3 or 4 pages with other insights and how I liked the guy, I didn't like the guy, he tried to fix me up with his daughter, and on and on and on and on. And that would be part of what they call the narrative midrash as well. Not just, most importantly, focusing on the text, but also giving us a lot of other detail about the teacher or the sage who was involved. So most of these midrashim, as I said, that run from maybe 400 to 1200 of the Common Era, are collected in anthologies. some of those anthologies are known by generic terms, the Great Midrash, the Midrash Rabbah, or Midrash Haggadol. So you got to argue which is, when one's earlier and one's later. The Midrash Rabbah is a much earlier collection, but then if you're trying to outdo the Great Midrash, what are you going to, you got to say, rather than just Midrash Rabbah, you're going to say Midrash Haggadol. That's the big, the large Midrash with a capital T and a capital L. The large Midrash is a little bit later. It's more extensive. Most of the collections on which that parallel to the Talmud, for example, and are in the first half of that period that I'm saying, 400 to 1200, and then there are collections from the collections that are more like in the 1200s, 1300s. So there might be a collection, one of the collections, Ein Yaakov, for example. Ein Yaakov only has legend that's the Agadah type of material. The Yalkut Shimoni only has legend stories that relate to the Torah rather than the rest of the Bible. Things like that. Let me just make one or two more comments and then we'll close for the day. It's important, and I'm giving you a little bit of a hint for next week. It's going to be important that anytime that you study Midrash, you must have a complete Bible at hand, or someone from the group. I'll have one if a couple other people can have it there for. But if you're doing it on your own, if you're trying to look for it on your own, not only do you need the text to make sure, and even if you don't know the Hebrew, but that you have the English, because usually the question will leap out at you. Professor Mahali said, students, you have to probe the text. But usually the question, once you get into the mindset, the question will leap out at you. Well, why did they say it this way as opposed to that way? Or why is Sarah's voice missing, but missing from the text, but what was going on in her relationship with Abraham and Isaac, so that intentionally the editors of the Torah left Sarah out of the story. What's going on. So you can usually, if you have the text, whether it's Hebrew or English, it will help you. You'll be able to see where the questions come from. But the other problem is that in the Midrash, in the collections specifically as we have them, most often, if they're dealing with a particular text as a proof text or as a raising the question text, they don't give you the entire text. Because they assume that you knew it. They assume that everyone who would be studying this knew the whole Torah or the Bible by heart. That was their milieu. That was their Wissenschaft, as we say in German. That was the situation in which they found themselves. So all they had to do was do something like this. If we're talking about American democracy, when in the course of human events, okay? I just have to say that, and I will assume that most people know that we're talking about, what is that? The Declaration of Independence, right? Okay. Fourscore and 7 years ago, something like that. Okay, and we know that we're talking about Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, and most of us had to memorize it the entire thing. That's what the rabbis, that's where they were. So when they wrote their comments or whatever, they might just give you the first few words of the quote, but not include the words that actually are the ones that they're commenting on, or that would give you the hint as to what they see the problem or the answer might be. So, yeah, and nowadays, all the editions of the Midrash would give the reference. It may not print the entire quote, but it would give you the reference. It would say, Genesis 27, verse 13. So you can go and look it up. But don't ever try to sit with, even in the most contemporary, like Norman Cohn, my dear friend who writes a lot of modern Midrash, on the sides of the page, gives the exact quotation so that you can see it, not only the full quote, but you can see it in context. So, any questions? Please, Steve. Please.
Well, just sort of a comment. There's an interesting book in my library that I have because it was a bat mitzvah present to my mother. And this is an English translation of a compilation by Chaim Nachman Bialik. And it's called Legends of the Bible. Now, is that his?
That's Bial. That's Sefer HaAgadah. It's a big book. Okay, that's Sefer HaAgadah. That's the book of legends. That's Bialik and Ravitsky is the co-editor. But I thought you were going to lead into something else. Bialik wrote, I don't know if it's a book, but I think it's an essay that people quote specifically. It's a long essay about the role of, using Agadah and whatever to understand Hebrew. And I thought that's where you're leading. I apologize.
But anyway, my question is, what was his resource for that? What's that Sefer Agadah exactly?
The Sefer Agadah is a more recent collection, and I've got it. I'll bring it. It's out in the other room. I've got it in Hebrew and in English. William Brody from Providence, a rabbi from Providence, translated the whole thing. That was his life's work. But Bialik and Ravnitsky went through. I guess chronologically would be the best way to say it. Starting with Midrash, it's comprehensive, but it's not total. It's not all of the literature. But they picked the ones that they thought were the most relevant, easily understood, whatever, the most familiar of the of all the midrashim about. And it's done, the better way to say it is it's done according to Torah portions. Mm-hmm. It follows that way. So here are some of the more famous ones, and we'll use one or two examples next week, from Genesis, from the stories of creation, and then Cain and Abel, and then Noah, and and here are some, and they give what the beauty of it gives all the references, it gives all the quotes in their entirety. But what Bialik and Ravnitsky did was they translated it into modern Hebrew, or the modern Hebrew of the 19th century. Okay. Yeah. But I mean, it's a huge volume, but it's a great collection.
Yeah.
Someone gave your mother a lovely gift.
Yeah. And just another interesting thing I wanted to bring up, there is a body of literature by Jewish authors who are Jewish authors, not Messianic authors, looking at the parables of Jesus.
Oh, absolutely.
From a Jewish perspective.
Absolutely.
Which personally I would find very interesting. I'm not a Messianic Jew. I'm going to declare myself as not that. Okay.
Right.
And that's not my perspective. I just see him as he was a very smart rabbi, and he had something to say, and the lessons What I've read of it is not antithetical to Jewish practice at all.
Well,
It's more
I'll
moralistic.
regular
and more
thought, like
ethical.
you standing on one foot, like
And-
Hillel and Shammai challenged us to do. The much of what Jesus said, preached, taught is very, very similar to Hillel's teaching, and and others from that time period. It's what happens afterwards. It's what happens who see Jesus as the Christ, and then develop an entirely new Israel, they called it. And so there's a New Testament that supersedes what all the other teaching. Why that happens is a whole different conversation. But the rabbis of the Talmud are aware of Jesus's teaching, and it's not necessarily that they're against what he is saying. It's they're against what Jesus's followers do with his words, and how they interpret it and go with their particular agenda.
Mhm.
But you're absolutely right. There's some very interesting collections. One of my colleagues, and I'm blanking on his name, one of my Reform colleagues in Minneapolis, and I'm truly blanking on his name, published a book with with a local Christian minister, and looking at texts, where this comes from, what it means, what the Jew sees in the Christian text, and what the Christian sees in the Jewish text, kind of thing. Yeah.
Don had a
Which-
comment.
Yeah, I had one question, Rabbi, but that last discussion, now I have two.
Okay, Don.
So the first one was, how does Ginsburg's Legends of the Jews fit into the...
It's the same kind of thing as the Bialik-Rudnitsky collection. It's just, and I forget, I think it follows the same kind of like a chronology of it, just picking and choosing his favorite midrashim. One of the differences is in format. If I remember correctly, the Ginsburg, which is like a 6-volume,
That's right, yeah.
Legends of the Jews. I think it's blue, but I'm trying to picture it on my bookshelf. It's almost like it's what he edits it as one continuous story. All right. Whereas the Bialik-Rudnitsky is, here's a midrashic interpretation of the quotation, "Let us make man in our image." Okay, and then or whatever. So if I remember correctly, that's what that is. But Ginsburg was a highly recognized and respected scholar. But it's not totally comprehensive. He picks and chooses and tells the narrative of Jewish history or of the Bible. But I know it's more than just the Torah. Going through the whole biblical text with those legends and midrashim that he feels are the most interpretive for him.
Okay, I've got volume 4. It's a huge collection of books, but I didn't know how it fit in. So this is a great discussion. It's really
That's I believe, I'm pretty sure that's the way it works.
Okay, and part 2 of my question, the last part, the little research I've done is that after the New Testament was codified, and we're talking about the parables here, that one school of thought that kind of followed the whole line of anti-Semitism was that the parables were delivered in order that the Jews, who were morally incapable, wouldn't understand the message.
There are some who would say that, but there's also the converse. Is parable, as we'll see, parable was a very popular way of teaching in the Jewish world.
Understood.
Okay, there are lots of parables. So it's not necessarily that the Jews wouldn't understand that, unless again you're talking in terms of that they had a secretive message, behind it. But I would see it more as when you talk about the gospel writers, is that some of them feel that they're writing for a Jewish audience, and some of them are writing for the audience that they're trying to turn against the Jews.
Understood. All I was saying was that it was codified, about 300 or 400 A.D. when the canon was finally
Right.
in order to cast Jews, in order to push the Jews further into absorbing the guilt and responsibility for the death.
Yeah, which fit into the theological position that they were trying to teach.
Yeah.
Whereas there certainly is a stream of scholarship that says no, the early Christian writers and proselytizers were trying to use as much as they could to break down the differences, and saying no, that we as the Christians, we have inherited your sacred literature and your sacred mission. You've turned away from it. We're bringing it back. So come and join us rather than be excluded. There's different approaches to it.
Right. Oh, okay. Thanks for
Marty.
Rabbi, if I may, and Steve, you may find this interesting, because of all of these episodes of 6 degrees of separation that have been coming up. In the story of the Exodus by Cecil DeMille, okay, there's a story that circulates that he chose Charlton Heston because of his broken nose. No other reason. When Charlton Heston appeared for the part, that's what got him the part. The other thing is, my dad.
And how is that 6 degrees? I didn't get it.
Now comes the 6 degrees.
Okay.
My dad was in advertising. He was a Madison Avenue guy. He knew Cecil B. DeMille, and actually did the campaign for that
movie,
that epic movie. And Susan, my wife, went to school with Cecil B. DeMille's niece. They roomed in the same dorm room. And they were very close friends for a good number of years. Also with my dad, he knew and worked with Lowell Thomas, and also Stanley Kubrick, and worked on all of the campaigns for all those different movies that from our era. So just so that I just wanted to give my dad a plug.
Well, again, Cecil B. DeMille, though he wasn't a rabbi,
right?
But he was fascinated. Apparently, he was fascinated by the question that it does appear in the Midrash, but it's one of those that they don't really have an answer to. There's a lot of speculation. But when he did some study, or some of his staff did some of the study of looking at the literature, especially around Moses on top of Mount Sinai and whatever, and there's this story that they couldn't decide who would do God's voice, okay, because the Torah only says that the people just heard the thunder and saw the lightning and whatever, but they didn't hear words. they respond by saying, all that we hear, we will do, we will follow through, but they didn't really hear words. And so Cecil B. DeMille, like kind of threw it out to his staff. Okay, so how do we do God's voice? Because the text doesn't really tell us anything, and da 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 da. And end result is that he said, I'm going to do it myself.
That's
So
right.
God, the God, thou shalt not, is actually Cecil B. DeMille's voice.
Interesting.
Right.
That's true.
Anyway, I
Well,
turned
but
it
by
back.
rights, the head of the studio should be God, right?
By rights, yeah. All right. Okay, Ruth Ann, it's all yours.
Oh, well, tomorrow's we have service, Saturday's Torah studies. Just keep watching. We got a lot of other stuff in the planning stages, and we like I keep saying, we might be closed, but we're very much functioning. So I hope, if anybody has any ideas, to keep Beth Shalom Temple Center going, let me know. And that's it.
Have a happy holiday weekend. Happy 4th
Yeah.
of July.
Oh, yeah.
4th of July.
And stay safe.
Oh, Gail, do you have something?
No, I was just saying thank you to you and the rabbi.
Yes.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Yes, Rabbi.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Take care.
We'll see you all
Okay,
soon.
we'll see
Take
everybody
care.
next time on
Stay
Zoom.
healthy. Okay.